Going to, there won't be anyone in here quite yet. I'm going to tweet out the link to this really quick.
And I'll go ahead and
Going to, there won't be anyone in here quite yet. I'm going to tweet out the link to this really quick.
And then as soon as I see it, I will retweet from my end.
All right.
A fly trying to get right in my webcam right there.
All right.
Okay. That sounds good. How's everything in your neck of the woods?
Pretty damn good. I can't complain. Looked like Clint might have been close to my neck of the woods recently, judging from Twitter, and he's going to be in your neck of the woods tonight, I hear.
Yeah, yes. I'm going to see if I can touch base with him later.
Nice. How's Florida? Hey, you know what? Speaking of Florida, I heard someone at work said, because COVID's kind of spiked around here a little bit. Florida, I heard, had the record numbers just this last week.
Yes.
Of course, that's what you heard.
Right. Yeah, it's new horror story every day. That's
Yeah.
all good.
All right.
But it is interesting seeing the pushback now in some of the blue areas. Like particularly if it's the most of the pushback I'm seeing now are former vaccine or current or vaccinated people saying no, like I'm not going back to masks anymore. I'm not doing any of this.
Yeah.
Again, this is all good stuff.
Yeah, I heard Dave and Jeff on the Tom Woods show. They mentioned that actor, I think Michael Rappaport or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like guys like that. Like, wait a second, this starts to feel like they've been bullshitting me this whole time. What are they telling me?
Yeah. I think Malice had the tweet today about how these people haven't gotten their biscuit for doing the right things yet, and they're not used to that. So there's some fraying at the edges there on what the appropriate pattern of this sort of stuff's supposed to be.
Yes, no doubt. It's kind of funny to watch some of it unravel.
Yes.
Yeah, there's people there. Popular Liberty, David Gleason. What's up, you guys?
Hello, guys.
So, Tho, I guess I'll give us a formal introduction. This is Counterflow Live. With me tonight is Tho Bishop, and he's been republishing issues of the Rothbard Rockwell report with the blessing of Lou Rockwell himself. And this was some of Murray Rothbard and Lou Rockwell's most controversial works, and it's some of my favorite works by them both through the 90s. And we're going to get into some of that. And Tho, welcome to the show. Hello.
Thank you for having me. Always a good time. And I'm interested to see how this episode plays. We were talking a little bit off here earlier. I think we're going to end up looking at two articles today, one of which is not 90s Rothbard at all. It's the antithesis of 90s Rothbard, and that is Left, Right, and the Prospects of Liberty. And that article I think is really fascinating because, again, it's really his breakup letter with the right in 65. It starts his entire kicks off this publication Left and Right with Leonard Liggio, and this was really kind of the beginning of his left-wing activist coalition building that lasts for about 5 years. It kind of falls apart in the 70s because the left gets surprise way too crazy. And this is when he's praising Shea and Left and Right, like the Left and Right stuff. It's funny for how controversial like the Triple R stuff is. Like there's stuff in Left and Right that should be even more controversial to libertarian circles. Like yes. Shea is the embodiment of revolution. You have the Negro Revolution, which is praising of Malcolm X and Black nationalism. I mean, there's some doozies, some bangers, as the kids might say. And Left and Right, but I think it's important to wrestle with this stuff because, for one, I think you see a lot of the consistency in Rothbard 60s and 90s, but it also shows how he builds an entire system for political outreach, which I think is interesting. And we're going to, before we get into that one, start off with a Triple R article, which is one of his several kind of autobiographical articles that end up making up the meat of Betrayal of the American Right, which is going to be looking at the old right as a political tradition and kind of what leads him to this period of left-wing outreach, which will then kind of be embodied by Left, Right, and the Prospects of Liberty. So again, it's not going to be kind of a traditional sort of the reddest meat of the paleo stuff, but I think it's important to putting in proper context the paleo stuff in the 90s and see, the similarities as well as where the differences lie.
Yeah, do you want to jump into that one then, the Triple R?
Yeah,
that is this one for those
yes.
following along at home: The Life and Death of the Old Right.
Yes. And so we'll go ahead and begin if that's good.
Let's do it.
So this is from September 1990. So again, this is the first year of the Triple R, and again, still kind of fleshing out the project here. So it begins again. This is part of the Why Paleo series. Again, the life and death of the old right. The libertarian movement was once a mighty movement, hardcore but not kooky, part of the mainstream of American ideological and political life. In the 18th and 19th centuries, for example, in the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian movements, libertarians were even the dominant political force in the country. America was indeed conceived in liberty. But right now, I'm not going back that far. I'm talking about the origins of the modern 20th century movement. For various reasons, the progressive movement had wiped out 19th century intellectual and political libertarianism. And in the 1920s, it was reduced to a few vibrant but lone intellectuals such as H.L. Mencken and his friend Albert J. Nock. So again, this is libertarianism very much on the wane. But then something happened to shook libertarianism back to life. The cataclysmic Great Leap Forward and to collectivism, hailed as the New Deal. It is a process of historical reaction. A sudden social change will often give rise to fierce opposition. Opposition to the New Deal was necessarily a coalition politics united on a negative, hatred of the socialism of the New Deal. Increasingly gathering into that coalition were the few libertarians or individualist intellectuals, the heritage and the remnants of the old Jeffersonian democracy left from the days of Grover Cleveland, men such as Senator James L. Reed of Missouri and Governor Albert Ritchie of Maryland, and Republicans, including former stalwart statists and progressives, such as Herbert Hoover, who condemned FDR for going much too far. As the New Deal intensified and was championed by the Democrats, the opposition inevitably coalesced around the Republican Party. It was a strange transformation since, from its inception in the 1850s, the Republican Party had always been the party of statism and centralized big government. Well, life is strange sometimes, and this shift was no stranger than what had happened to the Democrats in the 19th century, the party of minimal government and laissez-faire. So again, this is some of my most favorite parts of American history. He touches on some of those 19th trends there. Again, I think it's important because again, if we're looking for reasons to be white-pilled, to be optimistic, what he's outlining here is a libertarianism in far worse state, back then than it is right now. And so again, it was a response to a revolutionary expansion of power in terms of FDR's New Deal that ended up growing a coalition of which ideological libertarians were a minority, but an outsized portion because of kind of their intellectual tradition that their coalition partners did not quite have. When Roosevelt dragged America into World War II, returning to the article, the growing opposition, which I have called the old right, shifted its mooring and changed some of its alliances. Some economic free marketers, such as Lewis W. Douglas, became ardent pro-war New Dealers, while former progressives, mainly Republican, who opposed the war, began to see the deep connection between interventionism and big government and domestic as well as foreign policy. As a result, by the end of World War II, the old right, largely Republican, but still including Jeffersonian Democrats, such as Samuel Penningill of Indiana, was consistently libertarian, imposing statism at home and war and interventionism abroad. The old right was a strong and vibrant movement, dominant in the Republican Party in Congress, especially in the House of Representatives, and constituting roughly the Taft wing of the party. The old right was firmly opposed to conscription as well as war or foreign aid, favored free markets and the gold standard, upheld the rights of private property as opposed to any other invasion, including the despotism of coerced integration in the name of civil rights. The old right was socially conservative, middle class, welcoming people who worked for a living or met a payroll, and was the salt of the earth. What the old right lacked was not a political mass, but rather an intellectual cadre, and the small but increasing number of hardcore libertarians influenced by Mises, Rand, and Nock after World War II provided a growing intellectual foundation for that movement. This is, again, why he said the old right is here again after the Cold War collapse.
Mm-hmm.
What we have to realize, and we almost have to shake ourselves to believe, is that hardcore libertarians were not considered kooks and crazies. We were treated only as extreme variants of a creed that almost everyone on the old right believed: peace, individual liberty, free markets, private property, even the gold standard. And since we were simply consistent upholders of a creed which the entire old right believed, we were able, though small in number, to influence and permeate the views of the broad mass of the old right Americans. It was a happy symbiosis. So again, I think any paleo-libertarian movement right now has to identify, what is the common creed that we have with the rest of the populist right. It perhaps would not be, unfortunately, quite as pure as it is listed out here. That's why politically, all libertarians, whether minarchists or anarcho-capitalists, were happy to consider ourselves extreme right-wing Republicans. The general term for the broader movement was individualistic or true liberal or rightist. The word conservative was not at all in use before the publication of Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind in 1953. It was a great time for a libertarian to be politically active. Neither did the old right collapse with the onset of the Cold War. On the contrary, the old right reached a peak in its last days, for it was virtually the only opposition to the Korean War. Only the Communist Party of I.F. Stone opposed U.S. entry into the Korean War. The entire rest of the left, including Henry Wallace, supported it in the name of the old interventionist slogans: collective security against aggression. Major opponents of the Korean War, such libertarian old right publicists as Garrett Garrett and John T. Flynn, F.A. Harper, and Leonard E. Reed, influential newspapers such as the Chicago Tribune, and major political opponents such as Senators Bridges and Wary, and the Libertarian Congressman Howard H. Buffett of Omaha, father of Warren Buffett.
Mm-hmm.
It was after the Korean War that the old right collapsed. The catalyst was the literal theft of the Republican presidential nomination in 1952 from Senator Taft by the Wall Street elite behind Eisenhower. The deaths of Taft and Colonel McCormick, owner of the Chicago Tribune, and the capture of the political reins of the Republican Party by the conservative New Dealers, constituting the Eisenhower movement. Whereas the right-wing Republicans aimed to repeal and abolish the New Deal, the Eisenhower forces aimed at consolidating the New Deal and fastening it permanently upon American life, and this they succeeded all too well. But probably the most important reason for the collapse of the old right was not external blows, but the loss of its own soul and principles. As the older intellectual and political leaders died or retired, a powerful new force arose in 1955 to fill that vacuum. You can kind of see the storm clouds coming in. That name's about to rise. As the older intellectual and political, this new force, people grouped around National Review, set out to transform the nature of the American right, and they succeeded brilliantly. Headed by a brace of shrewd ex-communists steeped in Marxist-Leninist cadre organizing tactics, allied to youthful seaboard Catholics, the new right determined to crush isolationism and to remold the right wing into a crusade to crush communism all over the world, and particularly in the Soviet Union. At first, National Review held a patentee of individualism in order to capture the considerable amount of old right libertarian sentiment and wed it to a policy of global war. The Buckley Machine founded Young Americans for Freedom, still as its youthful political arm, still active today. The Intercollegiate Society of Individualists for Libertarian-Minded Student Intellectuals, and headed by National Review publisher Bill Rusher, moved to capture the young college Republicans, then the YRs nationally, and finally moved to dominate the Republican Party with the Goldwater movement. Early in this process, moreover, National Review in the late 1950s and early 1960s moved quickly to read out of the new right or conservative movement all extremists who would prove an embarrassment in its march to power. And so in a series of purges, the Birch Society, the Randians, and the Libertarians, those who remained isolationist, were ousted from the right wing. National Review and the new right were ready to achieve power, which they eventually would attain in the Reagan administration. But the point is that ideological transformation into a warmongering and vaguely theocratic movement was achieved by the early 1960s. The old right was dead, and those libertarians who still remembered and cleaved to those principles were out in the cold. What's interesting in this is that there are some Rothbard allies that never left the right. They're friendly to Buckley and National Review. Henry Hazlitt, for example, was a little bit more hawkish on the Soviet Union. Ludwig von Mises, never took that trip leftward, which we'll look to a little bit later, which I think is interesting. But again, there's a lot of very interesting sort of parallels in the intellectual environment in this, what he's describing the 1960s to what we see, I think, the last 10 years or so. Where were principled libertarians to go? Most of the older right libertarians who were still active were co-opted into the Buckleyite New Right, especially by the siren song of my friend Frank Meyer's Fusionism, the most libertarian wing of the Buckleyite coalition, but which retained the new voracious pro-war policy intact. What to do? Politically, I had been active in the Young Republicans from 1946 on, but left the Republican Party in high dudgeon when the Eisenhower forces stole the nomination for Taft. In 1956, I supported the last political gasp of the old right, the Andrews-Wardell third-party ticket for the presidency, but they were not on the ballot in New York. For years, I became interested in nascent third-party movements on the right, often attending the first organizing meeting, which turned out to be the last. One was a Constitution Party meeting held in some midtown restaurant owned by a sympathizer. As these movements fizzled and the right became increasingly pro-war, I began to support candidates based mainly on which were more pro-peace. A quirk of fate propelled me into a top spot among Stevensonian Democrats. I had not been involved in the three Stevenson races for president, two as nominee in 1952 and 1956, and one for the nomination against Kennedy in 1960, although I had preferred him to Eisenhower on two grounds: A, as being more pro-peace, and B, to punish and try to get rid of the New Deal Republicans. As time went on and the New Deal grew triumphant, B, I began to fade as an operative motive for me. At any rate, after Kennedy's defeat of Stevenson for the nomination in 1960, I noticed a little ad in the New York Post announcing a meeting of a proposed new organization, a Stevenson Pledge movement, demanding that Kennedy pledge to make Adlai Stevenson Secretary of State or else forfeit our support. Sounds great, I thought. I showed up to a small meeting of veteran Stevensonian organizers, which even included the nascent little Napoleon of Democratic campaign managers, Dave Garth. Dumbfounded that I had a PhD, the organizers quickly vaulted me into the number 2 spot of the new organization, the League of Stevensonian Democrats. The highly intelligent and charismatic leader, John Kuzel, was a young business executive and highly knowledgeable parliamentarian, always useful in political maneuverings. I was chief theoretician for the LSD, vice chairman and head of the National and International Issues Committee. Just imagine like Dr. Rothbard walking into this group. Like imagine sort of people that were attracted to these sort of meetings. And it's a very colorful image.
Pre-internet, to find out about some of these, reading pamphlets and kind of off the wall bookstores and oddball little spots. They were amazed by his PhD. I think that was brilliant.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And again, it only gets weirder from here on out when you get to the 65s and there on after. The Stevenson Pledge campaign naturally failed, and after exerting maximum noise against the Kennedy people, we beat a strategic retreat in return for which we were granted proprietorship over the main Kennedy store in Times Square, where right-wing libertarian friends of mine were confused to see me hawking Kennedy buttons. That was the farthest extent of our political patronage, however, after the Kennedy election. The LSD fell apart, and our maximum leader, Kuzel, moved upstate to rise up the corporate ladder. For many, it seemed like light years from extreme right-wing Republican to the leftish Democrat. But to me, opposition to war, as mass burner, and health of the state had been uppermost, and I was convinced that the right had abandoned libertarians, not the other way around. The most interesting incident of my months as an LSD activist came during the campaign. I wrote a letter to the Wall Street Journal urging right-wing Republicans to smash the New Deal by dumping Eisenhower and perhaps taking back the Republican Party. Reading the article, Kuzel was outraged and ready to expel me. And I was caught on the carpet. "What is this?" he asked. "Are you a right-wing spy?" We have to remember that was a period when no one had ever heard of the word libertarian. Mm-hmm. It was not the relative household word that it is now. In fact, the first time the word libertarian had ever been mentioned outside of our tiny movement had been in a chapter, God and the Libertarians, in a book of Apostles of Discord, in 1953 by professional anti-extremism. There were a lot of those in those days, attacking extremism rampant in the Protestant churches, that is, commies and right-wingers, equally evil. Particularly under fire were two genuinely libertarian periodicals, Faith and Freedom and Christian Economics. I think there's some interesting parallels there with this, the war against the extremism of both sides. I think we are in the start of a new phase of that. Confronted by Kuzal, I was not at all upset. After all, being a big shot in the League of Stevensonian Democrats was not exactly my life work. But I figured I owed him as my mentor in the organization an explanation. So I started in on what I figured would be an hour lecture. Well, you see, I'm a libertarian. Immediately, Kuzal interrupted. No one could ever accuse him of being slow on his feet, but I was still dumbfounded. Say no more, he said. I'm a libertarian too. And then he showed me an article he had written as head of some libertarian group in high school entitled Quo Warranto, by what right? Hurled at the government. From then on, I continued happily as number 2 man in the organization. Where are you now, John Kuzal? The nation needs you. Ideologically and personally, libertarians were soon to become isolated and stranded. Libertarians were either dying off or becoming co-opted in the pro-war new right. Ever since the early 1950s, I had been privileged to work for a magnificent, now long forgotten organization, the William Volker Fund, which single-handedly sought out, revived, and nurtured conservative and libertarian scholars, gave them grants to work on projects, organized conferences to meet with each other and discuss common concerns. In 1960, published these scholarly books and collections of articles that were unable to find a publisher in an intellectual atmosphere dominated by left liberalism. I wrote Man, Economy, and State, and Power and Market on a grant from the Volker Fund, as well as getting launched on Ethics of Liberty. Just on the brink of transferring its assets to an endowed libertarian think tank, the Volker Fund tragically collapsed in the winter of 1962, and the libertarian movement has never yet recovered from the terrible blow. For despite the strides made since, we have never attained the status of a fully endowed libertarian think tank to sponsor, advance, and publish scholarship. Someday, the full story of the rise and fall of the Volker Fund should be told. Suffice it to say that part of the collapse reflected the crisis at the broader movement. That is, the dramatic shift from old right to new, and the consequent sundering of the old harmonious joint conservative libertarian movement that had flourished from the 1930s to the 1950s. As a full-time analyst for the Volker Fund, I was on the beach. One of the Volker stalwarts then secured me a multi-year grant for what became my 4-volume Conceived in Liberty. After that, in the mid-1960s, I moved into academia. Politically, the capture of the Republican Party in 1964, with a National Review-dominated Goldwater movement, was for me, and for the remnant of the old rightists such as Felix Morley, a nightmare. I did the best I could within the embryonic libertarian movement to denounce the Goldwater movement as presenting a grave threat of nuclear war. I wrote an article blasting Goldwater for The Innovator, a California newsletter that served as one of the few libertarian periodicals at the time. I spoke before a group of Shervodian libertarian Georgists who were philosophically opposed to voting and had not cast their ballot in years. What I accomplished was a fierce argument with elder Chodovorians brandishing their canes in my direction, claiming, "Young man, I haven't voted in 30 years, but after hearing you tonight, I'm going out and voting for Barry Goldwater." I was particularly concerned to set forth my views on a libertarian foreign policy, but there was virtually no outlets for long libertarian articles. My theoretical defense of isolationist foreign policy, War, Peace, and the State, was published in 1963 in a short-lived University of Kansas libertarian student magazine, The Standard. And my sounding the alarm of the transformation of the American right could only be published in an obscure, now forgotten pro-peace Catholic journal, Continuum. Soon, however, conditions were to change, and the intensification of the Vietnam War led me to sound the call for an alliance with the emergent New Left on the war and the draft. The New Left phase in the modern libertarian movement was about to begin. And this is part of a multi-part series, but I think this kind of feeds the proper backstory getting to the left and right. But I always think that Rothbard's view on the Goldwater campaign is one of the most interesting aspects of this libertarian history, because Lou Rockwell himself was Goldwater man, yep, along with Hillary Clinton and others. Yep. So what are your thoughts? Just kind of looking at some of this backstory here, Buck. There you go.
That's funny because early on in my life, I'm not old enough to have actually gotten into Goldwater when he was running, but when I was getting into politics, I was attracted to his story, and my brother's named after him. A dirty secret is that I'm actually named after William F. Buckley. Sorry, Rothbard. Sorry, Lou Rockwell. That's just the case, but I'm trying to make up for it now. It's interesting. I've read, obviously, this article, but Murray's biography by Justin Raimondo called "Enemy of the State" has a lot of these themes in it. And there were moments when I read it where I kind of felt sorry for Murray in a strange way, and because he just kept bouncing around, like he was the same for the most part, but everything around him kept changing. And so he's just this guy wandering through various decades, like, will these guys like me? Will they listen to me? I always thought that was an interesting aspect of his life, and it feels like there was never a big solid group of people on a mass level that absolutely loved him and wanted him in their graces. Basically, it was always just kind of, the 60s was the left wingers, and then he figured out, wait, these people are nuts. And then it did seem like the 90s helped out this, because it did feel like there's multiple issues of this Rothbard Rockwell report where he does say, I found my home. These are my people. He did seem happier in those days and in that moment with the Patrick Buchanan, after he decided the Libertarian Party is just not for me. And I understand that sentiment for sure. So it did seem finally like he was happy, and then he passes away. So it's such a strange tale, and kind of with a sad ending. For me, I would like to have seen what else he would have done. Obviously, we know what would happen after 9/11 with his thoughts, but yeah, so much left on the table that we don't know.
And like what I love about his intellectual histories on this is for one, there's always his focus on institutions. You also see this in like the Guido Holzman biography on me. Like he goes into painstaking detail identifying all of the benefactors of Mises and Austrian allies, all the institutions that were built to support Mises. And, when he talks about the Volcker Fund and the fact nothing really emerged afterwards, I mean, again, like that kind of gets back to the tragedy of when he passed away in, early 95, because at the Mises Institute, by the time that this was written in September 90, or at least where it was published September 90, the Mises Institute was less than 5 years old right at that point. So it is becoming what they wanted the Volcker, kind of filling that void in a lot of ways, kind of for Rothbard and a lot of things. And it just didn't quite work. But and then some of the infighting there, like the Volcker Fund's collapse actually came from Rothbard writing a negative review of Christian Reconstructionism, which is interesting because of the Gary North connection. Gary North obviously was a good friend and ally of Lew and Murray in the Mises orbit, right? So that's just kind of some of the fun, very interesting stuff there. What's also neat is that, again, it's brought up in here, is the role that religious publications played. Mm-hmm. Because some of the early allies of Mises, and I think that this is part of his change in his view on Christianity, which I think is important for this larger Paleo project and the appreciation for religion where they're within. It was radical Presbyterians that are some of the early allies for Mises, but obviously, as I highlighted here, there was also kind of this parallel hardcore Catholic tradition and some of the institutions there, where again, like you had this atheist Rothbard, sometimes at the peak of his far left, publishing in those publications, again, still trying to reach to that remnant, and that natural, particularly when you consider the biggest disagreements. Beyond strategy between Mises and Rothbard, and I'm going to dive into some what I think is some interesting dynamics here with this left and right article. Mm-hmm. But obviously, it's Mises utilitarian, Rothbard as a natural rights theorist. Mises's utilitarianism is a little bit different than other uses of it, but it makes sense that Rothbard would always have kind of a place within some of these very conservative Catholic traditions. And I think in this current environment, right, where we're trying to reach out to this kind of growing interest in conservative Catholicism, conservative, Orthodox, the Orthodox Church, this, again, I think we've talked about this before. I think political right-wing revival requires some sort of Christian revival alongside of it. That yes. Natural rights aspect of Rothbard, even though he was never, a converted Christian, again, I think these are areas where this paleo strategy has particular, this particular brand of Rothbardian libertarianism has some unique advantages here. Any other thoughts on this before I get to?
No, yeah, I applaud him for his tempered atheism, because with a lot of atheists, they're more vocal about it than Southern Baptists are about their religion. And one of the unique things about Murray, I think, is that even amongst the paleo conservatives in this last few years of his life, when he's really courting segments of what I would call the religious right, he's not just some out and proud atheist where he leads with that. And I always thought that was interesting, because when I was very I thought that was the coolest thing to talk about. And it's how fun is it to disprove that you can't say that there's really a God, and, laugh at people like that. And it's a really shallow part of one's personality to have that attribute. And I'm glad I don't anymore. But Murray seemed to never really have that.
No, and it's interesting because it's not like because he doesn't hide his views. Like he doesn't pretend to be something that he's not. He just identifies, again, and it helps that he has that genuine respect for the Catholic tradition.
Right.
That and it's also interesting. Just it highlights some of the important cultural differences between America and Europe. Because I mean, when Mises was, who was far more critical of Christians than Murray ever was, it's because of experience with like Christian socialists within Europe. They're kind of a different breed in their theology. So again, all of this is very interesting. There's a fascinating paper on Rothbard's political thought by a scholar named John Payne. I don't know anything else by him. This was published in the Journal of Libertarian Studies in 2005, but it's called Rothbard's Time on the Left. I think the timing of this article makes a lot of sense because obviously, again, this is 4 years after 9/11, right? So you have, again, this similar sort of shift that you had in 65 reflected on LouRockwell.com and other Rothbardian publications and allies after the neocon retakeover after 9/11. But within this article, Rothbard's Time on the Left, which references this period of content that we're about to dive into, there's all sorts of very interesting historical little anecdotes in there and kind of tying out some other of the materials of that time. Like, for example, the framework outlined in Left and Right and the Prospects for Liberty is adopted by Ronald Hammaway, who was a writer for the Nation, which was one of the pillars of American leftism, in the 20th century. And so again, here you had the Nation publishing Rothbardian content explicitly inspired by him, as a result of this pivot. So again, it's absolutely remarkable the success that Rothbard had just by being that PhD theoretician showing up at these, political organization rallies full of young passionate kids, right? He was able to fill a void. And again, I think that this is a model of having answers that no one else has within political coalitions that are not true believers, but you're able to significantly shift things to your direction by simply being better. Again, this I think is the praxis of really what we're trying to do with the paleo strategy, because the paleo strategy is not simply trying to elect libertarians as Republicans. That's a great byproduct, but that is not the goal. The goal is to shift the dialogue within the American right towards a more libertarian perspective. And that does not require creating masses of new libertarians. That would be a great thing to do. Like that we're not actively against that, right? There's just other institutions that do deal with, libertarian incubators. But political strategy, what Rothbard is highlighting through this is that a small group of intellectuals can have an outsized impact. And that is what's so key here. And I feel like that is so often overlooked in all this. And so I really want to stress that.
Excellent. That's often, that's almost every time that's overlooked. There's this kind of assumption like you're trying to sneak in a libertarian into the Republican Party and get him elected and go, aha, see, there's the paleo strategy. We did it. And that's not the case. That's not what this whole thing's about. And
like, in all power to Eric Brakian, and all that stuff is great. I think it's a wonderful compliment. But again, these are some of just the minor differences. And again, you can disagree without. It's not even disagreement on end goals. It's just highlighting different aspects of all this. So again, so with having that as the backstory, we're going to get into the real meat of this episode, which is, again, Left, Right, and the Prospects of Liberty. And this is Rothbard's breakup letter with the right. This is the equivalent of his, case for paleo libertarianism for the left. And I think it's fascinating because so much of I don't want to say counterculture because it's so dated now, because these people do embody the modern zeitgeist of the culture. But I think so much of the cultural left libertarians, the proudly cultural left, rather than they don't recognize their leftist sort of default, libertarians like that. I think it is important to distinguish the two, but the proudly left-wing ones, they they're the children of Rothbard as well. And the intelligent ones, the well-read ones understand this. Like even the Corey Massiminos, a lot of like the C4SS crowd, right? This is why they don't like to talk about late Rothbard, because they love early Rothbard. This is the early Rothbard. And I think that there's a lot of stuff in here that is fascinating. Including some stuff about the French Revolution, which we'll get to.
Yes, kidding.
Which is talk to Jeff Deist about.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is from the inauguration of Left and Right, which again, the left-wing outreach platform of libertarianism in 1965, spring of that year. Left, right, and the prospects for liberty. The conservative has long been marked, whether he knows it or not, by long-run pessimism, by the belief that the long-run trend and therefore time itself is against him. And hence the inevitable trend runs towards left-wing statism at home and communism abroad. It is this long-run despair that accounts for the conservatives' rather bizarre short-run optimism. For since the long run is given up as hopeless, the conservative feels that his only hope of success rests in the current moment. In foreign affairs, this point of view leads the conservative to call for desperate showdowns with communism, for he feels that the longer he waits, the worse things will be electably be at home. It leads him to total concentration on the very next election, where he is always hoping for victory and never achieving it. The quintessence of the practical man, beset by long-run despair, the conservative refuses to think or plan beyond the election of the day. I think this is largely still quite true.
Yeah.
Pessimism, however, both short run and long run, is precisely what the prognosis of conservatism deserves. For conservatism is a dying remnant of the ancient regime, of the pre-industrial era, and as such, it has no future. In its contemporary American form, the recent conservative revival embodied the death throes of an electably moribund fundamentalist, rural, small-town, white Anglo-Saxon America. What, however, of the prospects for liberty? For too many libertarians mistakenly link the prognosis for liberty with that of the seemingly stronger and supposedly allied conservative movement. This linkage makes the characteristic long-run pessimism of the modern libertarian movement easy to understand. But this paper contends that, while the short-run prospects for liberty at home and abroad may seem dim, the proper attitude for the libertarian to take is that of unquenchable long-run optimism. The case for the assertion rests on a certain view of history, which holds first that before the 18th century in Western Europe, there existed and still continues to exist outside the West an identifiable old order. Whether the old order took the form of feudalism or oriental despotism, it was marked by tyranny, exploitation, stagnation, fixed caste, and hopelessness and starvation for the bulk of the population. In some, life was nasty, brutish, and short. And here was Maine's society of status and Spencer's military society. The ruling classes or castes governed by conquest and by getting the masses to believe in the alleged divine imprimatur to their rule. The old order was and still remains the great and mighty enemy of liberty. And it was particularly mighty in the past because there was no inevitability about its overthrow. When we consider that basically the old order had existed since the dawn of history and all civilizations, we can appreciate even more the glory and the magnitude of the triumph of the liberal revolution of and around the 18th century. This is interesting because the Hoppians that would, if any Hoppians listening to this, have to be just screeching right now, because yes. This is very much kind of like Rothbard, kind of like with almost like a Steven Pinker sort of view here, right? Like here's the great progress of the Enlightenment. This is a complete rejection of sort of that the neo-reactionary sort of a framework of the world, and I think it's interesting because I think that later Rothbard would find a lot more nuance with some of this, but it's interesting. What are your thoughts on?
Does this sound at all like a Whig version of history?
It gets a little close there.
That's what I think too.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that kind of baked in there, and again, it shows he's going to end up praising again, as we mentioned, the French Revolution, and there are some interesting aspects of the French Revolution as well. You can argue you could break up the French Revolution into various different parts, and there's the Good Revolution, and then you get the Reign of Terror. Right. But yeah, it's when I read this a couple of weeks ago for the first time in like 10 years, like it sounded very different on the ear than when I first read it in 2011. Part of the dimensions of the struggle has been obscured by a great myth of the history of Western Europe, implanted by anti-liberal German historians of the late 19th century. It's always those Germans. The myth held that the growth of absolute monarchies of mercantilism in the early modern era was necessary for the development of capitalism, since these served to liberate the merchants and the people from local feudal restrictions. In actuality, this was not at all the case. The king and his nation state served rather as super feudal overlords, and reimposing and reinforcing feudalism just as it was being dissolved by the peaceful growth of the market economy. The king superimposed his own restrictions and monopoly privileges onto those of the feudal regime. The absolute monarchs of the old order writ large and made even more despotic than before. Capitalism indeed flourished earliest and most actively precisely in those areas where the central state was weak or non-existent. The Italian cities, the Hanseatic League, the Confederation of the 17th century Holland. Finally, the old order was overthrown or severely shaken in its grip in two ways. One was by industry and the market expanding through the interstices of the feudal order, industry in England developing in the countryside beyond the grip of the feudal state and guild restrictions. More important was a series of cataclysmic revolutions that blasted loose the old order and the old ruling class. The English revolutions of the 17th century, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution, all of which were necessary to the ushering in of the Industrial Revolution and of at least partial victories for individual liberty, laissez-faire separation of church and state, and international peace. The laissez-faire separation of church and state is something I'm going to comment on here in a bit.
Right.
The society of status gave way, at least partially, to the society of contract. The military society gave way partially to the industrial society. The mass of the population now achieved a mobility of labor in place, an accelerating expansion of their living standards for which they scarcely dared to hope. Liberalism had indeed brought to the Western world not only liberty, the prospect of peace, and the rising living standards of an industrial society, but above all, perhaps, it brought hope. A hope in ever greater progress that lifted the mass of mankind out of its age-old sink of stagnation and despair. Soon there developed in Western Europe two great political ideologies centered around this new revolutionary phenomenon. The one was liberalism, the party of hope, of radicalism, of liberty, of the Industrial Revolution, of progress of humanity. The other was conservatism, the party of reaction, the party that longed to restore the hierarchy, statism, theocracy, serfdom, and class exploitation of the older order. Since liberalism admittedly had reason on its side, the conservatives darkened the ideological atmosphere with obscurant calls for romanticism, tradition, theocracy, and irrationalism. Political ideologies were polarized, with liberalism on the extreme left and conservatism on the extreme right of the ideological spectrum. That genuine liberalism was essentially radical and revolutionary was brilliantly perceived in the twilight of its impact by the great Lord Acton, one of the few figures of the history of thought who charmingly grew more radical as he grew older. Acton wrote that liberalism wishes for what ought to be, irrespective of what is. And working out this view, incidentally, it was Acton, not Trotsky, who first arrived at the concept of the permanent revolution. As Gertrude Himmelfarb wrote in her excellent study of Acton, his philosophy developed to the point where the future was seen as the avowed enemy of the past, and where the past was allowed no authority except as it happened to conform to morality. To take seriously this liberal theory of history, to give precedence to what ought to be over what is, was, he admitted, virtually to install a revolution in permanence. The revolution in permanence, as Acton hinted in the inaugural lecture and admitted frankly in his notes, was the combination of his philosophy of history and theory of politics. This idea of conscious that men carry with them the knowledge of good and evil is the very root of revolution, for it destroys the sanctity of the past. Liberalism is essentially revolutionary, Acton observed. Facts must yield to ideas, peaceably and patiently if possible, violently if not. The liberal, wrote Acton, far surpassed the Whig. The Whig governed by compromise. The liberal begins the reign of ideas. One is practical, gradual, ready for compromise. The other works out a principle philosophically. One is a policy aiming at a philosophy. The other is a philosophy seeking a policy. So again, here is where again this is again pure left wing Rothbard in the truest sense right here. Dismissal, dismissing romanticism, tradition, structured religion essentially, and contrasting it with the extreme left of constant revolution. What do you hear when you hear some of this material?
It's I love Rothbard, and I can see why there was some contentious feelings between him and other people that I like. So it's funny timing with the episode that Jeff put out with Human Action podcast. That essay from Kirk. I can't remember what year that was written, but when you see some of this, there are parts of that essay that I kind of understand, and I almost feel sacrilege saying that because this is Rothbard, and we have the expertise of hindsight,
Yeah,
and where we're at now, and that's what this is interesting. Yeah, I mean, some of this is in 2021 strikes me as like, oh my goodness, kind of
yeah.
crazy. But you have to. It's hard for us to put ourselves in the waters he was swimming in at the time, because
Well,
that's really largely what this is about.
well, it's also interesting though because again, I think that even though he was writing this in '65, and I think that so '65, so he was I think he was about 40 at this time. But I think but again this sort of material, this sort of framework, this perspective history would have fit very well with kind of what I thought the libertarian sort of narrative was like back in the earlier Ron Paul days, right?
Yes.
You yourself just had mentioned that your atheist days and things like that, and so I think this is like 10 years ago, like this is sort of stuff I remember first reading this article. I was like, oh yeah, like this is absolutely right, like
Yep.
the entire political framework is wrong and yada yada. And again, it's just I think it says a lot about the last 10 years and the intellectual conversations on the right and the libertarian right. And again, I think a lot of that is that Hoppe influence with the
Yep.
neo-reactionaries that have created. I mean, because again, like it's really this clashes so much with that. There's something even I think much more interesting though that um, a true student of Mises would pick up on, and that's that like there's always this tension with Mises and Rothbard kind of later on, like beyond like the economic stuff. It's funny because there's a lot of Austrian, like the Hayekian sort of
Yeah.
mainline economists that will kind of dismiss Mises and Rothbard. Cursors a true error. That there was always never really good airing on that in terms of economic methodology, but there always was something to be said about this tension between Mises as a minarchist and Rothbard as an anarchist. If you'll watch Bettina Bain Graves, who's a wonderful woman, I mean, a great benefactor of the Mises Institute. I'm not trying to take any sort of cheap shots there, but like some of her speeches that she would give later on, I think in the 90s, and she was one of the people identifying Kerzner as being closer to Mises. And I think a lot of this has to do with this political realignment right here.
Yes.
Because there's letters back and forth between, like we know that Mises kind of thought that, he had a letter sent to him that said, like, it's a shame that a great mind like Murray was going to pot by allying himself with the old left. But Greaves in particular, her husband, Percy Greaves, a fascinating man in his own right, was the lead counsel for Republicans in the Minority Report looking at Pearl Harbor. He's a very politically incorrect analysis of FDR's involvement in Pearl Harbor, if you want to go down that rabbit hole. This turn towards the left, I think, created one of the biggest rifts between the Mises crowd and the Rothbardian crowd, because a lot of the circle Bastiat, which was, there were Misesians, there were the younger Misesians, Ralph Rako and Religio and George Reisman, who became kind of a Randian. A lot of that crowd kept surrounding Murray, and I think that there is a little bit of friction here, whereas like, Mises kind of stayed friendly to Buckley when Rothbard is portraying this sort of stuff. And again, I think that it's funny because Mises is the last night of liberalism, right? Like, Mises, like there is some just very interesting differences here that I think matter in terms of kind of some minor differences within the personalities of this Austro-libertarian thought, school of thought.
And they're still there within it
Yeah.
now. And it's people we love, but
Yeah.
I can sense the ones that gravitate to this and the ones that don't.
Yeah. Again, if you think back to like that post 9/11 era, let's say between 9/11 and like maybe 2014, 2012 ish, like that's when you have like the Robert Longs, right? You have a lot of proudly left wing libertarians within the Mises orbit, again, kind of building off of this orbit, this sort of framework here. I think even I've never read it, but who's Jeff Riggenbach, who was a proud, one of the really good intellectual left libertarians. He's got a wonderful article on Gore Vidal, which is obviously I just read the other day. He has like an entire sort of revisionist look at the old right that is kind of that pushes back against some of Rothbard's narrative, which is also kind of interesting. So again, there's all sorts of really kind of neat rabbit holes if you're into this whole thing. But going back to the article, what happened to liberalism? Why then did it decline during the 19th century? This question has been pondered many times, but perhaps the basic reason for inner rot within the vitals of was an inner rot within the vitals of liberalism itself. For with the partial success of the liberal revolution in the West, the liberals increasingly abandoned the radical fervor and therefore their liberal goals to rest content with a mere defense of the uninspiring and defective status quo. Kind of sounds like the counter-revolutionary narrative of the American Revolution, which was written around there during this time for Rothbard. Two philosophical roots of this decay may be discerned. First is the abandonment of natural rights and higher law theory for utilitarianism, as we mentioned earlier. For only forms of natural or higher law theory can provide a radical base outside the existing system from which to challenge the status quo, and only such theory furnishes a sense of necessary immediacy to the libertarian struggle by focusing on the necessity of bringing existing criminal rulers to the bar of justice. Utilitarians, on the other hand, in abandoning justice for expediency, also abandon immediacy for a quiet stagnation and inevitably end up as objective apologists for the existing order. I think that is very true. The second great philosophical influence on the decline of liberalism was evolutionism or social Darwinism, which put the finishing touches to liberalism as a radical force in society. For the social Darwinists, erroneously saw history and society through the peaceful rose-colored glasses of infinitely slow, infinitely gradual social evolution, that kind of a rejection of that Whig theory of history. Ignoring the prime fact that no ruling caste in history has ever voluntarily surrendered its power, and that therefore liberalism had to break through by means of a series of revolutions, the social Darwinists looked forward peaceably and cheerfully to thousands of years of infinitely gradual evolution to the next supposed inevitable stage of individualism. An interesting illustration of a thinker who embodies within himself the decline of liberalism in the 19th century is Herbert Spencer. Spencer began as a magnificently radical liberal, indeed virtually a pure libertarian. But as the virus of sociology and social Darwinism took over in his soul, Spencer abandoned libertarianism as a dynamic historical movement, although at first without abandoning it in pure theory. In short, while looking forward to an inevitable idea of pure liberty, Spencer began to see its victory as inevitable. But only after millennia of gradual evolution, and thus in actual fact, Spencer abandoned liberalism as a fighting, radical creed and confined his liberalism in practice to a wary, regarded action against the growing collectivism of the late 19th century. Interestingly enough, Spencer's tired shift rightward in strategy soon became a shift rightward in theory as well, so that Spencer abandoned pure liberty, even in theory, for example, in repudiating his famous chapter in Social Statics, the right to ignore the state. In England, the classical liberals began their shift from radicalism to quasi-conservatism in the early 19th century. A touchstone of this shift was the general British liberal attitude toward the national liberation struggle in Ireland. The struggle was twofold: against British political imperialism and against feudal landlordism, which had been imposed by that imperialism. But their Tory blindness toward the Irish drive for national independence, and especially for peasant property against feudal oppression, the British liberals, including Spencer, symbolize their effective abandonment of genuine liberalism, which had been virtually born in a struggle against the feudal land system. Only in the United States, the great home of radical liberalism, where feudalism had never been able to take root outside the South, did the natural rights and higher law theory and consequent radical liberal movements continue in prominence into the mid-19th century. In their different ways, the Jacksonian and abolitionist movements were the last powerful radical libertarian movements in American life. There's some interesting stuff there, because I think that's actually, again, this was written at the same period with overlap of Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty. And I think there are some important dynamics there when it comes through when you read Conceived in Liberty, like particularly volume 5, because he talks about how like the left-wing Jeffersonians are going against the right-wing nationalist Hamiltonians, and this nature of kind of losing the passion, kind of believing in the inevitability of liberalism in the long run, and so moderating the short term. This is something very true for the Jeffersonians. Jefferson himself kind of embraces this. Like President Jefferson is very, like, particularly second term Jefferson is like awful. And so again, there's a lot of there's a variety of different aspects in it, and it's also why like the American political, like that Jacksonian era is so fascinating, because like it really is one of those rare moments of a revival of like red hot libertarianism being injected back into the political party. Like the Martin Van Buren squad, I mean, they literally called they described themselves as radical Republicans. And so yeah, it's just a fascinating period seeing that sort of revival, under that great man of history, that Jacksonian sort of level. I mean, there's just there's some interesting stuff in there. Thus, with liberalism abandoned from within, there was no longer a party of hope in the Western world, no longer a left movement to lead a struggle against the state and against the unbreached remainder of the old order. Into this gap, into this void created by the drying up of radical liberalism, there stepped a new movement, socialism. Libertarians of the present day are accustomed to think of socialism as the polar opposite of the libertarian creed. But this is a grave mistake, responsible for a severe ideological disorientation of libertarians in the present world. As we have seen, conservatism was the polar opposite of liberty, and socialism, while to the left of conservatism, was essentially a confused, middle-of-the-road movement. It was, and still is, middle of the road because it tries to achieve liberal ends by the use of conservative means. In short, Russell Kirk, who claims that socialism was the heir of classical liberalism, and Ronald Hammaway, who sees socialism as the heir of conservatism, are both right. For the question is on what aspect of this confused centrist movement we happen to be focusing on. Socialism, like liberalism and against conservatism, accepted the industrial system and the liberal goals of freedom, reason, mobility, and progress, higher living standards for the masses, and an end to theocracy and war. But it tried to achieve these ends by the use of incompatible conservative means, statism, central planning, communitarianism, etc. Or rather, to be more precise, there was from the beginning two different strands within socialism. One was the right-wing authoritarian strand from St. Simon down, which glorified statism, hierarchy, collectivism, which was thus a projection of conservatism trying to accept and dominate the new industrial civilization. The other was the left-wing, relatively libertarian strand, exemplified in their different ways by Marx and Buchanan, revolutionary and far more interested in achieving libertarian goals of liberalism and socialism, but especially the smashing of the state apparatus to achieve the withering away of the state and the end of the exploitation of man by man. Interestingly enough, the very Marxian phrase, the replacement of the government by men by the administration of things, can be traced by a circuitous route from the great French radical laissez-faire liberals of the early 19th century, Charles Comte, no relation to Auguste Comte, and Charles Dunoyer. Yeah, I'm not going to butcher that. And so too many, and so too may the concept of the class struggle, except that for Dunoyer and Comte, the inherently antithetical classes were not businessmen versus workers, but the producers in society, including free businessmen, workers, peasants, etc., versus the exploitating class constituting and privileged by the state apparatus. St. Simon at one time in his confused, chaotic life was close to Comte and Dunoyer and picked up his class analysis from them. In the process, characteristically getting the whole thing balled up and converting businessmen on the market, as well as feudal landlords and others of the state privileged, into exploiters. Marx and Buchanan picked this up from the Saint Simonians, and the result gravely misled the entire left socialist movement. For in addition to smashing the repressive state, it became supposedly necessary to smash private capital ownership of the means of production. Rejecting private property, especially of capital, the left socialists were then trapped in a crucial inner contradiction. If the state is to disappear after the revolutionary, immediately for Buchanan, gradually withering for Marx, then how is the collective to run its property without becoming an enormous state itself, in fact, even if not in name? This was a contradiction that neither the Marxists nor the Buchananists were ever able to resolve. So again, this I think is very interesting. This is something that this aspect of like kind of classical liberal class theory. It's something that Hoppe ran with.
Mm-hmm.
It actually plays out in Mises's Liberty and Property to a certain extent, because like Mises begins by talking about pre-capitalist order, and he identifies that the great capitalist revolution was precisely that. It allowed for the control of capital goods to be placed in to be placed in the hands of those serving the masses rather than the privileged state classes. And it's so like this is something that it reads like, you know, if you have no background to this sort of material, socialism as the moderate, you know, center way sounds crazy, but
Yeah.
actually I think this is some of the best meat of this article, even though that this is very clearly, you know, there is an objective that he has by emphasizing this, right? His objective is to extend the hand to supporters of Shea and like the radical young socialists of the 60s. But even though that is very deliberate in its political aims, this material, I think, you know, this material is also very true, and I think there's some very interesting stuff in that.
Yes, we're getting to some of my favorite parts of this essay.
Having replaced radical liberalism as the party of the left, socialism by the turn of the 20th century fell prey to this inner contradiction. Most socialists, Fabians, Lassalleans, even Marxists, turned sharply rightward, completely abandoned the old libertarian goals and ideals of revolution and the withering away of the state, and became cozy conservatives, permanently reconciled to the state, the status quo, and the whole apparatus of neo-mercantilism, state monopoly capitalism, imperialism, and the war that was rapidly being established and reverted on European society at the turn of the 20th century. For conservatism, too, had reformed and regrouped to try to cope with a modern industrial system and had become a refurbished mercantilism, a regime of statism, marked by state monopoly privilege in direct and indirect forms to favored capitalists and to quasi-feudal landlords. The affinity between right socialism and the new conservatism became very close. The former advocating similar policies, but with a demagogic populist veneer. Thus, the other side of the coin of imperialism was social imperialism, which Joseph Schumpeter trenchantly defined as an imperialism in which the entrepreneurs and other elements woo the workers by means of social welfare concessions, which appear to depend on the success of export monopolism. Historians have long recognized the affinity and welding together of right-wing socialism with conservatism in Italy, Germany, in Italy and Germany, where the fusion was embodied first in Bismarckism and then in fascism and National Socialism. The latter fulfilling the conservative paradigm or program of nationalism, imperialism, militarism, theocracy, and a right-wing collectivism that retained and even cemented the rule of the old privileged classes. But only recently have historians begun to realize that a similar pattern occurred in England and the United States. Thus, Bernard Simmel, in his brilliant history of the social imperialist movement in England at the turn of the 20th century, shows how the Fabian Society welcomed the rise of the imperialists in England. When in the mid-1890s, the Liberal Party in England split with the radicals on the left and the liberal imperialists on the right, Beatrice Webb, co-leader of the Fabians, denounced the radicals as laissez-faire and anti-imperialist, while hailing the latter as collectivists and imperialists. An official Fabian manifesto, Fabianism in the Empire, 1900, drawn up by George Bernard Shaw, who was later, with perfect consistency, to praise the domestic policies of Stalin and Mussolini and Sir Oswald Mosley, lauded imperialism and attacked the radicals who still clung to the fixed frontier ideals of individualist republicanism and non-interference. In contrast, a great power must govern a world empire in the interest of civilization as a whole. After this, the Fabians collaborated closely with Tories and liberal imperialists. Indeed, in 1902, Sidney and Beatrice Webb established a small secret group of brain trusters called the Coefficients as one of the leading members of the club. The Tory imperialist Leonard S. Amory revealingly wrote, Sidney and Beatrice Webb were more concerned with getting their ideas of the welfare state put into practice by anyone who might be prepared to help, even on the most modest scale, than with their early triumph of the avowedly socialist party. There was, after all, nothing so unnatural as Chamberlain's own career had shown in a combination of imperialism and in external affairs with municipal socialism or semi-socialism at home. Other members of the Coefficient, who, as Amory wrote, were to function as brain trusts or general staff for the movement, were the liberal imperialist Richard B. Haldane, the geopolitician Halford Mackinder, the imperialist and germaphobe Leopold Maxey, and publisher of the National Review, the Tory socialist and imperialist Viscount Milner, the naval imperialist Carolyn Bellairs, the famous journalist J.L. Gavin, Bernard Shaw, Sir Clinton Dawkins, partner of the Morgan Bank, and Sir Edward Grey, who at a meeting at the First Club embrated the policy of Entente with France and Russia that was to eventuate into World War I. The famous betrayal during World War I of the old ideas of the revolutionary pacifism by the European socialists and even by the Marxists should come to as no surprise that each socialist party supported its own national government in the war, with the honorable exception of Eugene Victor Debs' Socialist Party in the United States, was the final embodiment of the collapse of the classic socialist left. From then on, socialists and quasi-socialists joined conservatives in a basic amalgam, accepting the state and the mixed economy equal neo-mercantilism and the welfare state and interventionism and state monopoly capitalism, merely synonyms for the same essential reality. It was in reaction to this collapse that Lenin broke out the Second International to reestablish classical revolutionary Marxism and a revival of left socialism. In fact, Lenin was almost without knowing it accomplished more than this. It is common knowledge that purifying movements, eager to return to a classic purity shorn of recent corruption, generally purify further than what they had held true among the original classic sources. There were indeed marked conservative strains in the writings of Marx and Engels themselves, which often justify the state, Western imperialism, and aggressive nationalism, and it was these motifs and their ambulance, views of the masters of the subject, that provided the fodder for the later shift of the majority of Marxists into the socialist imperialist camp. Lenin's camp turned more left than Marx and Engels themselves. Lenin had a decidedly more revolutionary stance in the state, and consistently defended and supported movements of national liberation against imperialism. The Leninist shift was more leftist in other important senses as well. For while Marx had centered his attack on market capitalism per se, the major forces of Lenin's concerns was on what he conceived to be the highest stages of capitalism, imperialism and monopoly. Hence, Lenin's focus on centering, as it did in practice, on state monopoly and imperialism, rather than a laissez-faire capitalism, was in that way far more congenial to libertarianism than that of Karl Marx. And again, this right here, you kind of get this fascination with Lenin strategy and tactics, yes, which presents itself in a variety of different areas where Rothbard talks about strategy. But I think it's just all very interesting. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, he in this same essay that we kind of read earlier, The Life and Death of the Old Right, in the next issue of the Rothbard Rockwell report, he actually gets into that in relating to the paleo strategy. He actually talks about Leninist tactics and things like that.
Yes, I know that there will be some people on Twitter very excited about that aspect of it.
Yes.
I also think that there is, I think, an interesting aspect where he talks about at the end about like how Lenin was different than Marx and his focus on kind of high capitalism, right? The monopoly and imperialistic privileges and things like that. Ryan McMakin had a good article several years ago, which I think is interesting, looking at the socialism of Ecuador, which again, like obviously all socialism is bad, right? This is not a praising of the regime there, but Ryan makes the point that like what that Ecuadorian socialism really was a focus on sort of neoliberal foreign investors trying to come in, but so it was very protectionist against foreign corporations, at top, but that the actual operations of markets at the lower levels of the economy, like you had a lot of freedom to the market economy for residents and stuff. Like there's costs, obviously, in creating barriers to international investment, right? So again, there's costs there, but I think it's interesting because there's aspects of this I think still in play in here, and that's something that kind of plays out in different. You see that play out in reality in different aspects still today, which it's worth noting at times when diving into. Which are the lesser of two evils when like comparing like a Bush era former IMF guy trying to take over a South American country versus a workers' rights sort of activist leftist. It's not always as obvious as the biggest socialist bad. Right. And it's particularly, I think it's the Peruvian situation with the left wing guy winning there is going to be interesting to watch in that regard as perhaps a new example of this. Fascism and Nazism were the local culmination in domestic affairs of the modern towards right-wing collectivism. It has become customary among libertarians, as indeed among the establishment of the West, to regard fascism and communism as fundamentally identical. But while both systems were indubitably collectivist, they differed greatly in their socioeconomic content. Communism was a genuine revolutionary movement that ruthlessly displaced and overthrew the old ruling class, while fascism, on the contrary, cemented into power the old ruling class. Hence, fascism was a counter-revolutionary movement that froze a set of monopoly privileges upon society. In short, fascism was the apotheosis of modern state monopoly capitalism. Here was the reason that fascism proved so attractive, which communism, of course, never did, to big business interests in the West, openly and unabashedly so in the 1920s and early 1930s, and I would argue 2020s. We are now in a position to apply our analysis to the American scene. Here we encounter a contrasting myth about recent American history, which has been propagated by current conservatives and adopted by most American libertarians. The myth goes approximately as follows. America was, more or less, a haven of laissez-faire until the New Deal. Then Roosevelt, influenced by Felix Frankfurter, the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, and other Fabian and communist conspirators, engineered a revolution which set America on the path of socialism and further on beyond the horizon to communism. The present-day libertarian who adopts this or similar view of the American experience tends to think of himself as an extreme right-winger. Slightly to the left of him then stands a conservative. To the left of that stands the middle of the road, and then leftward to socialism and communism. Hence the enormous temptation for some libertarians to red bait, for since they are American, see America as drifting inexorably leftward to socialism, and therefore to communism, the great temptation is for them to overlook the intermediary stages and tar all of the opposition with the hated red brush. One would think that the right-wing libertarian would be quickly able to see some dramatic flaws in this conception. For one thing, the income tax amendment, which he deplores as the beginning of socialism in America, was put through Congress in 1909 by an overwhelming majority of both parties. To look at this event as a sharp leftward move towards socialism would require treating President William Howard Taft, who put through the 16th Amendment, as a leftist. And surely few would have the temerity to do that. Indeed, the New Deal was not a revolution in any sense. Its entire collectivist program was anticipated approximately by Herbert Hoover during the Depression, and beyond that by the war collectivism and central planning that governed America during World War I. Every element in the New Deal program, central planning, creation of a network of compulsory cartels for industry and agriculture, inflation and credit expansion, artificial raising of wage rates, and promotion of unions within the overall monopoly structure, government regulation and ownership, all this had been anticipated and adumbrated during the previous 2 decades. And this program, with its privileging of various big business interests at the top of the collectivist heap, was in no sense reminiscent of socialism or leftism. There was nothing smacking of the egalitarian or the proletarian here. No, the kinship of this burgeoning collectivism was not at all with socialism, communism, but with fascism or socialism of the right, a kinship which many big businessmen of the 20th century expressed openly in the yearning for abandonment of quasi-liberal fair system for a collectivism which they could control. And surely William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Clark Hoover make far more recognizable figures as proto-fascists than they do as crypto-communists. The essence of the New Deal was seen far more clearly than in the conservative mythology by the Leninist movement in the early 1930s, that is, until the mid-30s, when the exigencies of Soviet foreign relations caused a sharp shift of the world communist line to Popular Front, approved of the New Deal. Thus, in 1934, the British Leninist theoretician R. Plam Dutt published a brief but scathing analysis of the New Deal as social fascism, as the reality of fascism cloaked with a thin veneer of populist demagogy. No conservative opponent has ever delivered a more vigorous or trenchant denunciation of the New Deal. The Roosevelt policy, wrote Dutt, was to move to a form of dictatorship of a war type. The essential policies were to impose a state monopoly capitalism through the NRA, to subsidize business, banking, and agriculture through inflation, and the partial expropriation of the mass of the people through lower real wage rates, into the regulation and exploitation of labor by means of government fixed wages and compulsory arbitration. When the New Deal, wrote Dutt, is stripped of its social reform as progressive camouflage, the reality of the new fascist type of system of concentrated state capitalism and industrial servitude remains, including an implicit advance to war. That effectively concluded with a quote from an editor of the highly respected current historical magazine: "The new American will not be capitalist in the old sense, nor will it be socialist. If the trend is towards fascism, it will be an American fascism, embodying the experience, the tradition, and the hopes of a great middle-class nation. Again, this right here, I think you're touching on some of that managerial revolution sort of stuff, right? It's a recognition that this is a system for big business. This is by no means socialism for the masses. The handouts and all of this are simply a means of keeping the masses placated as you see a extreme consolidation of power. Again, I think there's a lot here that is very interesting. Any thoughts on that particular revisionist history of the New Deal?
Yes, because look at where we're at right now. And to Rothbard's point about quote unquote conservatives not being able to see this for what it is, look at Sean Hannity right now. When you watch him, he's going to describe what we're witnessing with the Biden administration and this big pharma stuff as communism. Very much what Rothbard is pointing out as a criticism that conservatives keep saying this is a movement leftward towards communism, et cetera, when it's really just it's giving the masses something to placate them. And it is fascism. It's corporate fascism is what this is. Call it right or left. We can parse that out. But I think this is some of the meat of this article is this stuff right here. And I Rothbard's take on the New Deal is kind of as a right-wing conspiracy, I think is actually quite brilliant. And this is the stuff where I learned all of this. No one learns this in school, this version of it. And so this Rothbard's revisionism of this stuff is extremely pertinent to where we're at right now in this country.
And it's interesting because this is also part of the old right critique of this era as well. I mean, Garrett Garrett's great article, right? The Revolution was his whole point was that, all these people on the right talking about, oh, well, the socialist revolution is coming. And he's like, no, it's already happened. It's come from behind us. We just didn't see it. It was not and again, this is kind of, this sort of, that is kind of strings that strikes at some of the chords within this sort of revision here. That again, I think there's a lot of very important stuff, and again, I think particularly within this current environment, any modern admirers of Huey Long would find some stuff in here as well that would perhaps play to their view.
Yes.
I'm going to skip a little bit further down so we kind of get more to the New Deal history. And so, that this whole period concludes with that's the New Deal. After a bit of leftist wavering in the middle of the late 30s, the Roosevelt administration resubmitted its alliance with big business in the national defense and war contract economy that began in 1940. This is an economy of polity that has been ruling America ever since, embodying the permanent war economy, the full-fledged state monopoly capitalism, and neo-mercantilism, the military-industrial complex of the present era. The essential features of American society have not changed since it was thoroughly militarized and politicized in World War II, except that the trends intensify, and even in everyday life, men have been increasingly molded into conforming organization men serving the state and its military-industrial complex. William H. White Jr., in his justly famous book, The Organization Man, made clear that his molding took place amidst the adaptation by business of the collectivist views of the enlightened sociologists and of other engineers. It is also clear that this harmony of views is not simply a result of naivety by big businessmen, not when such naivety coincides with requirements of compressing the worker and the manager into the mold of the willing servitor and the great bureaucracy of the military-industrial machine. And under the guise of democracy, education has become mere mass drilling and the techniques of adjustment to the task of becoming a cog in the vast bureaucratic machine. Meanwhile, the Republicans and Democrats remain bipartisan in forming and supporting the establishment as they were in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Me Tooism, bipartisan support of the status quo that underlines the superficial differences between the parties, did not begin in 1940. How did the corporal guard of remaining libertarians react to these shifts of the ideological spectrum in America? An instructive answer may be found by looking at the career of one of the great libertarians of the 20th century, Albert J. Nock. In the 1920s, when Nock had formulated his radical libertarian philosophy, he was universally regarded as a member of the extreme left, and he so regarded himself as well. It is always a tendency in ideological and political life to center one's attention on the main enemy of the day. And the main enemy of that day was the conservative statism of the Coolidge-Hoover administration. Coolidge. It was natural, therefore, for Nock, his friend and fellow libertarian H.L. Mencken, and other radicals to join quasi-socialists in battle against the common foe. This I think is very key. That entire period right there, like that is Rothbardian political philosophy. It is always the tendency in ideological and political life to center one's main attention on the main enemy of the day.
As I've got that underlined. That's exactly what I've got underlined here.
When the New Deal succeeded, Hoover, on the other hand, the milk and water socialists and the vaguely leftist interventionists hopped on the New Deal bandwagon. On the left, only the libertarians such as Nock and Mencken and the Leninists before the Popular Front period realized that Roosevelt was only a continuation of Hoover and other rhetoric. It was perfectly natural for the radicals to form a united front against Roosevelt with the older Hoover and Al Smith conservatives who either believed Roosevelt had gone too far or disliked his flamboyantly populist rhetoric. But the problem was that Nock and his fellow radicals, at first properly scornful of their newfound allies, soon began to accept them and even donned cheerfully the formerly despised label of conservative. With the rank and file radicals, this shift took place, as have so many transformations of ideology in history, unwittingly and in default of proper ideological leadership. For Nock, and to some extent for Mencken, on the other hand, the problem cut far deeper. For there had always been one grave flaw in the brilliant and finely honed libertarian doctrine hammered out in their very different ways by Nock and Mencken. Both had long adapted the great error of pessimism. Both saw no hope for the human race ever adopting the system of liberty. Despairing of the radical doctrine of liberty had ever being applied in practice, each in his own personal way retreated from the responsibility of ideological leadership. Mencken joyously and hedonically, Nock haughtily and secretively. Despite the massive contributions of both men to the cause of liberty, therefore, neither could ever become the conscious leader of the libertarian movement, for neither could ever envision the party of liberty as the party of hope, the party of revolution, or a fortiori, the party of secular messianism. The error of pessimism is the first step down the slippery slope that leads to conservatism, and hence it was all too easy for the pessimistic radical Nock, even though still basically a libertarian, to accept the conservative label and even come to croak the old platitude that there is an a priori presumption against social change. It is fascinating that Albert J. Nock thus followed the ideological path of his beloved spiritual ancestor Herbert Spencer. Both began as pure radical libertarians. Both quickly abandoned radical or revolutionary tactics as embodied in the will to put their theories into practice through mass action. And both eventually glided from Tory tactics to at least partial Toryism of content. I think this gets really key to the motivating energy behind Rothbard, the man, right, as a system builder, because you can very clearly see that he spends his entire life trying to be the anti-Mencken and Nock.
Yes,
and by taking this retreatist approach. And so the libertarians, especially in their sense of where they stood on the ideological spectrum, fused with the older conservatives who were forced to adopt ideological phraseology, but with no real libertarian content, in opposing a Roosevelt administration that had become too collectivistic for them, either in content or in rhetoric. World War II reinforced and cemented this alliance, for in contrast to all the previous American wars of the century, the pro-peace and isolationist forces were all identified by their right and subsequently by themselves as men of the right. By the end of World War II, it was second nature for libertarians to consider themselves at an extreme right-wing pole, with conservatives immediately to the left of them, and it's the great error of the spectrum that persists to this day. In particular, the modern libertarians forgot or never realized that opposition to war and militarism had always been a left-wing tradition which had included libertarians, and hence when the historical aberration of the New Deal period corrected itself and the right wing was once again the great partisan of total war, the libertarians were unable to understand what was happening and tread along in the wake of their supposed conservative allies. The liberals had completely lost their old ideological markings and guidelines. Given a proper reorientation of the spectrum, what then would be the prospects for liberty? It's no wonder that the contemporary libertarian, seeing the world going socialistic and communistic and believing himself virtually isolated and cut off from any prospect of united mass action, tends to be steeped in Lockean populism. But the scene immediately brightens when we realize that the indispensable requisite of modern civilization, the overthrow of the old order, was accomplished by mass libertarian action erupting in such great revolutions of the West as the French and American revolutions, and bringing about the glories of the Industrial Revolution and the advances of liberty, mobilizing and rising living standards that we still retain today. Despite the reactionary swings back to statism, the modern world stands towering above the world of the past. When we consider also that, in one form or another, the old order of despotism, feudalism, theocracy, and militarism dominated every human civilization until the West of the 18th century, optimism over what man has and can accomplish mounts still higher. It might be retorted, however, that the bleak historical record of despotism and stagnation only reinforces pessimism, for it shows the persistence and durability of the old order and the seeming frailty and evanescence of the new, especially in view of the retrogression of the past century. But such superficial analysis neglects the great change that occurred during the revolution of the New Order, a change that is clearly irreversible. For the old order was able to persist in its slave system for centuries precisely because it awoke no expectations and no hopes in the minds of submerged masses. Their lot was to live and eke out their brutish subsistence in slavery while obeying unquestionably the commands of their divinely appointed rulers. But the liberal revolution implanted indelibly in the minds of the masses, not only in the West, but in the still feudally dominated undeveloped world, the burning desire for liberty for the land to the peasantry, for the peace between the nations, and perhaps above all, the mobility and rising standards of liberty that can only be brought to them by an industrial civilization. The masses will never again accept the mindless serfdom of the old order, and given these demands that have long been awakened by liberalism and the Industrial Revolution, long-run victory for liberty is inevitable. I think that there might be some elites today trying to challenge the proposition that the masses will never once again accept the mindless serfdom of the old order, just with a new fancy build. For only liberty, only a free market can organize and maintain an industrial system. And the more that population expands and explodes, the more necessary is the unfettered working of such an industrial economy. Laissez-faire in the free market become more and more evidently necessary as an industrial system develops. Radical deviations cause breakdowns and economic crises. This crisis of statism becomes particularly dramatic and acute in the fully socialist society, and hence the inevitable breakdown of statism has first become strikingly apparent in the countries of that socialist camp. For socialism confronts its inner contradictions most starkly. Desperately, it tries to fulfill its proclaimed goals of industrial globe, higher standards of living for the masses, an eventual withering away of the state. It's increasingly unable to do so with its collectivist means. Hence the inevitable breakdown of socialism. This progressive breakdown of socialist planning was at first partially obscured, for in every instance, the Leninists took power not in a developed capitalist country, as Marx had wrongly predicted, but in a country suffering from the oppression of feudalism. Second, the communists did not attempt to impose socialism upon the economy for many years after taking power. In Soviet Russia, until Stalin's forced collectivization of the early 1930s reversed the wisdom of Lenin's new economic policy, which Lenin's favorite theoretician, Bukharin, would have extended onward toward a free market. Even the supposedly rabid communist leaders of China did not impose a socialist economy on that country until the late 1950s. In every case, growing industrialization has imposed a series of economic breakdowns so severe that communist countries, against their ideological principles, have had to retreat step by step from central planning and return to various degrees of forms of a free market. The Lieberman plan for the Soviet Union has gained a great deal of publicity, but the inevitable process of desocialization has processed much further in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Most advanced of all is Yugoslavia, which freed from Stalinist rigidity earlier than its fellows in only a dozen years, has desocialized so fast and so far that its economy is now hardly more socialist than that of France. The fact these people call themselves communists are still governing the country is irrelevant to the basic social and economic facts. Central planning in Yugoslavia has virtually disappeared. The private sector not only predominates in agriculture, but is even so strong in industry, and the public sector itself has been so radically decentralized and placed under free pricing, profit and loss tests, and cooperative worker and owner of each plant that true socialism hardly exists any longer. Only the final step of converting workers' syndical control to individual shares of ownership remains on the path toward outright capitalism. Communist China and the able Marxist theoreticians of Monthly Review have clearly discerned the situation of raised the alarm of Yugoslavia is no longer a socialist country. Again, I think that the relevant modern stuff here is the economic model of China, as well as just kind of just highlighting the differences between how much longer a managerial sort of interventionist sort of state lasts over the true socialism of say the Soviet Union and Cuba and other areas. Again, just what is the greater threat here to liberty? Socialism ends much quicker than this middle of the road aspect. Um, um, Part of I think what makes the Chinese model particularly now interesting is that you've seen the accelerationism of credit expansion, which you also see in America and other areas. I think I know one part Mises talked about what's the true mark of socialist economy. He pointed to the stock market, and I think there's something that might be said about the degree to which stock markets in the modern world are so subsidized and juiced by credit expansion that like the real CCP control over the Chinese economy is in the dictation of capital markets rather than kind of the bureaucratization of storefronts. I think there's some very interesting stuff within that. Here we're getting some stuff. Well, one would think that the free market economists would hail the confirmation and increasing relevance of the notable insight of Professor Ludwig von Mises a half century ago. The socialist states, being necessarily devoid of a genuine price system, could not calculate economically and therefore could not plan their economies with any success. Indeed, one follower of Mises, in effect, predicted this process of desocialization in a novel some years ago. Yet neither this author nor free market economists have given the slightest indication of even recognizing, let alone saluting, this process in the communist countries. Perhaps because their almost hysterical view of the alleged threat of communism prevents them from acknowledging any disillusion in their supposed monolith of menace. Again, this goes, I think, directly to Rothbard's longstanding critiques of the of the Cold War right and its failing to recognize the inevitable doom of the Soviet Union. We're getting near to the end here. Let's see. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit more.
Okay.
Communist countries, therefore, are increasingly ineradically forced to desocialize and will therefore eventually reach the free market. The state of the undeveloped countries is also cause for sustained libertarian optimism. For all over the world, the people of the developed nations are engaged in revolution to throw off their feudal old order. It is true that the United States is doing its mightiest to suppress the very revolutionary process that once brought it and Western Europe out of the shackles of the old order. But it is increasingly clear that even overwhelmingly armed might cannot suppress the desire of the masses to break through into the modern world. I think this is some interesting stuff. Yeah. We are left with the United States in the countries of Western Europe. Here, the case for optimism is less clear. For the quasi-collectivist system does not present as stark a crisis of self-contradiction as does socialism. And yet here too, economic crisis looms in the future and gnaws away at the complacency of the Keynesian economic managers. Creeping inflation, reflected in the aggravating balance of payments breakdowns of the once almighty dollar, creeping secular unemployment brought about the minimum wage scales, the deeper and long-run accumulation of the uneconomic dislocations of the permanent war economy. Moreover, potential crises in the United States are not merely economic. There is a burgeoning and inspiring moral ferment among the youth of America against the fetters of centralized bureaucracy, of mass education and uniformity, and of brutality and oppression exercised by the minions of the state. Furthermore, the maintenance of a substantial degree of free speech in democratic forms facilitates, at least in the short run, the possible growth of a libertarian movement. The United States is also fortunate in possessing, even if half forgotten, beneath the status and tyrannical overlay of the half century, a great tradition of libertarian thought and action. The very fact that much of this heritage is still reflected in popular rhetoric, even though stripped of its significance and practice, provides a substantial ideological framework for a future party of liberty. What the Marxists would call the objective conditions for the triumph of liberty exist, then everywhere in the world, more so than in any past age, for everywhere the masses have opted for higher living standards and the promise of freedom, and everywhere the various regimes of statism and collectivism cannot fulfill these goals. What is needed then is simply the subjective conditions for victory. That is, a growing body of informed libertarians will spread the message to the people of the world that liberty and the purely free market provide the way out for the problems and crises. Liberty cannot be fully achieved unless libertarians exist in number to guide the people to the proper path. But perhaps the greatest stumbling block to the creation of such a movement is the despair and pessimism typical of the libertarian in today's world. Much of that pessimism is due to his misreading of history and his thinking of himself and his handful of conferees as irredeemably isolated from the masses and therefore from the winds of history. Hence, he becomes a lone critic of historical events rather than a person who considers himself as part of a potential movement which can and will make history. The modern libertarian has forgotten that the liberal of the 17th and 18th centuries faced odds much more more overwhelming than those which face the liberal of today. For in the era before the Industrial Revolution, the victory of liberalism was far from inevitable. And yet the liberalism of that day was not content to remain a gloomy little sect. Instead, it unified theory and action. Liberalism grew and developed as an ideology, leading and guiding the masses, made the revolution which changed the fate of the world. By its monumental breakthrough, this revolution of the 18th century transformed history from a chronicle of stagnation and despotism to an ongoing movement advancing toward a veritable secular utopia of liberty, rationality, and of abundance. The old order is a dead moribund, and the reactionary attempts to run a modern society and economy by various throwbacks to the old order are doomed to total failure. The liberals of the past have left the modern libertarians a glorious heritage, not only of ideology, but of victories against far more devastating odds. The liberals of the past have also left a heritage of the proper strategy and tactics for libertarians to follow, not only by leading rather than remaining aloof from the masses, but also by failing prey to short-run optimism. For short-term optimism being unrealistic leads straightway to delusion and then to long-run pessimism. Just as on the other side of the coin, long-run pessimism leads to exclusion and self-defeating concentration on immediate and short-run issues, short-run optimism stems from one thing, from a naive and simplistic view of strategy. That liberty will win merely by educating more intellectuals, who in turn will educate opinion molders, who in turn will convince the masses, after which the state will somehow fold its tent and silently steal away. Matters are not that easy. For libertarians face not only a problem of education, but also a problem of power. And it is a law of history that a ruling caste has never voluntarily given up its power. The problem of liberty is certainly in the United States, but the problem of liberty the problem of power is certainly in the United States far in the future. For the libertarian, the main task of the present epoch is to cast off needlessly and debilitating pessimism, to set his sights on long-run victory, and to set out on the road to its attainment. To do this, he must perhaps, first of all, drastically realign his mistaken view of the ideological spectrum. He must discover who his friends and natural allies are, and above all, perhaps, who his enemies are. Armed with this knowledge, let him proceed in the spirit of radical long-run optimism that one of the great figures in the history of libertarian thought, Randolph Bourne, correctly identified as the spirit of youth. And it concludes with a very long excerpt from Bourne, which I'll let other people find. But again, I think that's interesting because, like, the ending of this essay, in spite of the fact that its framing is very much leftward, it is celebrating leftism throughout history as the center of liberty. It is outright, again, it is praising Lenin and denouncing the conservatives. It is promoting secularism, rationality against traditions and theocracy. In spite of all of those framings, which I think are very clearly left-right cultural dynamics, this aspect here, where we should not be naive to the short term. We should keep, but remain optimistic. That we should identify who our enemies are and who our potential allies are, and engage with energy and an optimism with them in order to pursue a state of the world that we see desire. Again, this is true both in this left outreach of 65 alongside the paleo strategy of the 90s. And this is, I think, the praxis of this Rothbardian strategy that is so important. What do you think there, concluding this long essay?
Well, it's interesting because there was moments where I've got stuff highlighted here that sounds familiar from people today that I don't know that I totally agree with. And then there's some stuff, like you just said, he basically ends with kind of a populist sentiment, which he revisited decades later. I want to get your thoughts on this. What is needed then is simply the subjective conditions for victory, growing body of informed libertarians who will spread the message to the peoples of the world that liberty and the purely free market provide the way out of their problems and crises. Liberty cannot fully be achieved unless libertarians exist in number to guide the people to the proper path. Perhaps the greatest stumbling block to the creation of such a movement is the despair and pessimism typical of the libertarian in today's world. Because there's some of that I hear maybe from the Libertarian Party that I'm not sure that just creating more libertarians through a message is a thing right now. Again, this is 65 and we're in 2021. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it reads a little, dare I say, perhaps a little naive. Though I
Mm-hmm.
do think, though I do think it balances well with his latter part about power also
Yeah.
being necessary, because the
Yep.
idea is not simply like, oh well, if we have people on the street corner, doing the evangelical sort of route, that'd be enough. It's that you need you simply don't need, it's not sufficient simply to have numbers of libertarians, but libertarians in positions to help guide others down this path. And I think that there's obviously validity within that. Though again, I think a little bit of this is kind of this call to arms to kind of this growing movement of pamphleteers and this he's trying to really promote the evangelical nature of the libertarian movement, kind of
Yeah.
again within this age, because again he's trying to create this separate intellectual foundation, completely disconnected from all of the institutions of that old right tradition. So again, I understand it strategically, but I do think it sounds a little, it sounds a little, I there's a little bit more, I think to it than what it sounds like.
Do you think some of that spirit's what I mean? This is 65, just 5 to 6 years later, led him to help with the creation of the Libertarian Party. Do you think some of this led to that?
Yes, and I think that's one of the really interesting things about this, because, like, for one, like, I think it's very telling that he has this very beautiful theoretical defense of the left, and then he interacts with the left for like 4 years, and like, now I'm done with these people.
Yeah, exactly.
and again, I like that, because again, he's trying his best, like he's giving a full throated, he's doing his best to build an entire system which to perfectly align his views with far left activists, right?
Yeah.
But again, like, it only takes 4 years dealing with these people to say, I'm out. Like, you guys are nuts. And I think there's something very telling about that, right? Like, the people of a movement matter as much as the ideas of the movement. And Rothbard learned that lesson near this time. But I think it does reflect that, I think that following this growth, following this Rothbardian move, I think it's fair to view the American libertarian movement, at least the political activist wing, as being firmly a product of the left, as outlined here by Rothbard. Now, the American libertarian movement proper, which is built in the 70s, it doesn't simply consist of these Rothbard political activists, right? You have the Randians, which which Rand herself obviously very dismissive of the L word, but a lot of Randians were not. Right,
Mm-hmm.
it always starts with Ayn Rand, right? Those culturally are obviously not coming from this worldview here, right? So like that, so that's part of you have the three-legged stool of conservatism, right? Of Cold War hawks, Christian conservatives, and free marketeers. Well, like you have the three-headed, you kind of got a similar sort of stool of the libertarian movement of left-wing Rothbardians, Randians, and the free market libertarians that wanted to go for the hardcore stuff. And so that I think is just an interesting aspect of that libertarian movement. And again, I think all of this sort of sets the stage where, again, Rothbard's critique of the liberty movement in the 90s has to do with the quality of the individual, with some of the same problems that haunted him during the late 60s, I think carried over the 70s and 80s in the experiences with the LP. But again, it's just, but again, it's fascinating seeing the depth of the analysis here, the revisionist history on the American side. And again, you can already see, relatively early on in his political career, the how much he had thought deeply into the strategy aspects. Again, going down that Leninist route, which goes to some very interesting places later on.
Do you think Rothbard would have, and maybe I'm trying to make myself feel better here, but in the 2000, let's say 2002 to 2007, who do you think he would have been reaching out to?
I think he would have reached out to the left again. I think that he would have followed Lou. I think that Lou's instincts there were, if I had to guess, would have been very similar. And again, and rightfully so, because like that was where the threat was coming from.
Yeah.
Again, like you see a degree here where he views, it was the threat of Goldwater military action. Again, part of throughout all of this is his continued focus on foreign policy as being one of the main drivers because war is the health of the state.
Yeah.
Again, like, he didn't buy into. Again, my assumption is I would have been a Goldwater guy in '64.
Me too.
But again, the fact that Rothbard, was reversed on that, particularly considering Bush foreign policy, I think that he would have taken that turn to the left, which again Raimondo did. That whole libertarian, movement. Really until kind of the Ron Paul days when you have kind of the in the Tea Party and the Republican Party, like that's kind of the pivot back to the populist right a little bit, and then things go from there. You don't have it's that period. I think you would have had that same sort of reverse back to the left, right, and the prospects of liberty aspect. And again, this article was very. I think this article was very big. It was a very key part of that Mises Institute zeitgeist. That I think there's a lot of people that look back and they don't like the right wing populist sort of stuff. Like they look at this as this spirit being the golden age of the Mises Institute content. And I understand it from their perspective. I'm just glad that it's no longer the case. Like I much prefer the paleo stuff to the celebrating the French Enlightenment, the French Revolution. But again, I respect the hell out of the intellectual weight of this document right here.
Yes, as do I. And people ask often about old right and paleo conservatives and what to read and stuff. And I did want to mention this book here, The Revolt from the Heartland, is very readable, very digestible. As you can see, it's not too thick, but it also covers kind of the history of the old right and then the paleo conservatives. And it's got Rothbard in here and the paleo libertarian stuff as well. So just a side note, I highly recommend this because I know a lot of people that watch and listen to me are interested in stuff like this.
Well, and there's also all sorts of interesting stuff in the '90s as well, where again, that's where you have like the Gore Vidals, the Bill Kaufmans that were always part of that sort of classical left tradition. Again, then all of them sort of all end up in the same sort of camp, which I think is fascinating. And like Bill Kaufman has he's a book about I think it's Anarchism Comes Home, looking at various old style conservative sort of private law sort of arrangements. Again, it's a fascinating overlooked period of literature from seeing how many of these aspects all kind of coalesce within this '90s era of Triple R and other things. Again, there were some really interesting things going on there. Again, it's a shame that that 9/11 as a complete transformation of American politics. But again, I think that there's stuff that rhymes here today, and there's so much here that you can hear some of the relevance of Rothbard's specific sort of critiques here. I think hit directly to some of the concerns that the populist right has on what they perceive as the libertarian views of power. Rothbard always has kind of a contrasting narrative that I think offers a lot more opportunity for outreach than a lot of say like strongly materialistic defenses of capitalism or kind of cosmopolitan sort of defenses of capitalism. The atomistic, individualized, pleasure-seeking units of humanity sort of approaches to libertarianism, right? This tradition has something unique to offer within this political environment.
Let me ask you this before we get out of here also, because this is going to come up a lot, or it should, I think, in what we would call a renewed spirit of paleo-libertarianism. There's a lot of bright young minds on the right that are popping up, like our friend Pedro Gonzalez and people of that nature. What sentiment or what stuff do we need to bring to them, do you think?
I think first and foremost is recognizing that the economic system we have now is an indefensible means of ripping us off. And there's sometimes pushback from people that I think are making very important cases about how like, oh, well, things aren't terrible right now. Like, life expectancy is way up, right? We have access to all these sort of resources and things like that. And, you'd much rather be the poorest person in the world right now than the poorest person in the world 10 years from now. And so you don't want to get overly, too fixated on the doom. And I get that to certain degrees. And some countries, right, that argument might be a lot more important. but I think it's fair to, but I think it is tone deaf to in America, because I do think that while the material well-being of your average American is much better now than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, just because technological innovation, I do think that there is something to be said about the larger psychological state of, the consolidation of power is something that we've never before seen. The degree to which the structures of the current system actively subsidize irresponsible behavior is on a scale that we've never seen before. And that gets to my frustration with these very same actors, because there is such a disinterest in central banking, where like if you're going to identify what is the mark of all of this, it is you see very clearly the historical trends changing in 1971. But then if you accept, and this is where I think even some Austrians, because we're so that the fishes don't understand water sort of reference. Since we've been living in 10 years of this really and crazy monetary policy, I think it's easy for us to underestimate like just how my candle's trying to get away. Like how insane these past decade in particular has been. And so we recognize that there's four ways that a corporate, so when we talk about corporate power or state power, right? There's four ways that an entity gains power, right? It does it through trade, right? For production and trade, which some of these corporations are, but that's obviously not the majority of where the changing dynamics are. It comes through confiscation of goods and services. It comes through confiscation of money, and then it comes through inflation, and like the degree to which the inflationary aspect and the credit expansion of this past 10 years is directly responsible for taking of real resources from, let's call it the masses, and to these privileged state actors that are identified in this article. That is something that we cannot ever take for granted. Like we need to hit that time and time again, because again, like precisely when it's this consolidated federal of corporate power that is then being used as the organs of the state, again, as outlined by Rothbard in this article, similar to the FDR era stuff.
Yes.
Like this gets to the core of all the issues. And so then we have to figure out, like, how do we break this up? Because like it's interesting, like the history of populism, going to the point about Rothbard talking about how we can better explain the right solutions. The history of populism always deals with the masses wanting either restoration of land, right, some sort of land reform. It goes to, they want cheaper bread or some sort of cheaper food supply. They want, I think increasingly now, obviously cheaper medicine. And so all of these concerns are valid, right?
Right.
The problem with that populist economics is not that they're seeking to fix these problems of the masses. The problem is that if your solution to bread prices is simply subsidies, well, then the short term that might work, but in the long term, right, you're going to create issues.
Right.
If your issue to land reform is simply tearing down just contracts, rather than kind of like selling off state land, right? The problems are just, and so good economics teaches you how to properly handle these things in a way that are actually going to create the long-lasting outcomes that benefit the people, right? And so so the question is like, what do those secondhand, what does that transitionary period look like? And I've never seen a really good example of a transitionary period. This is true from the American Revolution, right? Because like you have this very interesting and I think valid debate over the Hamiltonian line, over honoring contracts of speculators, versus like the Jeffersonian line, which is they throw out all the debts. Rothbard said it with the Jeffersonians, but like it could be argued that America's contract law is benefited from that Hamiltonian bailout of speculators.
Yes.
Now there are some very horrible, like you can see some interesting contrasts, like the Shays Rebellion was inspired by the Massachusetts government that didn't only simply repay speculators at full par, but paid them specifically in specie, the hard money, rather than the devalued company. And so that's like the absolute worst, like cronyist bailout of financial speculators right there. So like again, there's ways of making it much, much worse than like the Hamiltonian. But if you like the fall of the Soviet Union, you had a lot of corruption that started off because like in Lithuania, for example, all the citizens of Lithuania were given shares of previously socialized property. And then you had the similar sort of situation you had in early America where, the poor people sold them off to larger entities, right? And so people were, and then when so then you had people saying, oh, this isn't fair because I sold my stuff and I don't have it. And so there's always going to be sort of that mushy, that messy sort of in-between period where there's going to be some corruption. We live in a fallen world. How you manage that transition is like, that's where we need to put a lot more focus on. Because we've got a lot of the theories, right? We understand the way it should look. We understand the critiques of the system as is. It's that interconnectionary period of how do you break up power from here to there. That's where we need more focus on, and I think that gets to some of the points that I was making in my economic populism argument, where the battle right now is between, the biggest threat is giving more power to the enemy, which is the federal government, right? The better alternative is these competing institutions against the federal government, like states. Yes. And because so once you have states breaking up sort of that common market of corporate privilege, which again I think it's an imprecise sort of measure there, and you'll some libertarians will make perfectly fine arguments against calling Facebook, a bastion of state privilege, fine, whatever. But ultimately, I think forcing these corporations in America to have to jump through state level hoops on trying to deal with very real bads that come from this current order, like any libertarian that believes giving social media the right to kick off candidates running against other candidates and not seeing the very real impact that has on the democratic process as it currently exists, I'm sorry, you're missing. This is political speech. This is not a product of the market. This is a byproduct of democracy as a political unit, and so we have to take that, right? Yes. And we have to recognize that, and common law allows for, responding to problem as they exist, and this is a very real problem. And so yeah, a long-winded answer there, but again, I that's why Rothbard is worth reading no matter what decade it is. I think aesthetics, I just think the value of 90s Rothbard, for one, 90s Rothbard has a lot more wisdom than 60s Rothbard did, just because everybody should 30 years later. But as much as anything, though, it's just identifying what are the alliances that can exist in the time, in this specific period. And again, we should reject political universalism in all its forms, yes, including centralized power and a one-size-fits-all strategy throughout time and space. So
yes, and Jared brought up a good point. I was actually going to say this. Well put, yes. Jared. That somehow pointing out to smart, good right-winger conservatives that the Federal Reserve itself basically incentivizes high time preference behavior, yes, at all levels. Yes. I think is something I would like to be able to get it, and without sounding like just a bumper sticker in the Fed or something like that, to where they're not going to grasp what you're talking about, but being able to explain the fact that its very existence incentivizes high time preference across the board is part of the issue here.
This is Pedro. Pedro's number one critique of all of this sort of stuff is that he rejects this kind of materialistic sort of framework of all of this, right? There are things beyond material things that we should value, and he's absolutely correct. The problem is that the defenders of capitalism have, and part of it, again, I understand they're trying to respond to, hey, you're just trying to defend the big businessman, right? You're trying to defend an Ayn Rand parody. No, what capitalism does is improves the quality of life of the people at the bottom. Look, I get those arguments; those are fine, but those are not enough. Ultimately, what makes capitalism great is not simply that it creates free stuff or cheap stuff for people that would otherwise go without. The important thing is that it creates a stable society, and the alternative is a society of constant chaos and confusion. Market prices help identify the proper way of allocating resources to better to serve the actual desires of the population as it exists. And that requires real prices, and that requires functioning capital markets, and that requires property rights, and that requires et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of their critiques of the breakdown of the family and the destruction of the pride of individual workers and all of that sort of stuff, all of those are products of the intervention that they so seek. And of course, I'm preaching to the choir here. I know this is not novel to anyone listening to this, but I think there is that if we can ground our defenses more in that sort of the cultural conservative benefits of markets, that
Yeah.
rejection of a purely materialistic sort of view on these sort of things, that I think has so much more power. Because again, the beauty of it is that this sort of line is almost completely alien to this sort of people to the right. And Mises has this point, right? The ideas that change society are the ones that have previously not been heard. Well, obviously we've heard of these ideas, but they haven't. And so again, we're not going to convince these people by telling them the same sort of libertarian catchphrases that they've heard time and time again. You can win them over by telling them something new. And that's what Ron Paul did. The Ron Paul era was about bringing something new to this general libertarian sphere with the Austrian economics, with the, with his sort of unique homespun sort of spin on things. And that is what made him powerful. That's what made him so much more effective than Reason and Nick Gillespie and all that crowd. And that is why we should be adapting those practices to these potential new potential allies in the modern day.
Yeah, well put. I guess we can. I know you got some eating and hanging out to do later this evening. You're an hour later than I am. So, any words as we get out of here to anyone out there? Whatever you want to say, though.
No, this has been fun again. Thank you for providing a platform for this, and as you've been so generous of doing for many months now, in a variety of ways. And I love the comments in the stream. Thank you guys all for all of that. And let's do this again soon.
Yeah, thank you guys. There's a bunch of Hoppians in there. There's a bunch of Renegade media people, Renegade University people. Thank you guys for joining us on this live stream. And it's going to be seen by a bunch of people way after this. So thank you guys so much. Though, thank you for being here.
Thank you, guys.
And we're about to end this stream when I figure out, like the boomer I am, how to close it out. Thank you guys for watching Counterflow Live.